The Mughal Empire was not a small regional kingdom that briefly flickered and vanished. At its height, it controlled a vast stretch of South Asia, extending from the edges of the Indus Basin in northern Afghanistan to Kashmir in the north, and far east toward present-day Assam and Bangladesh, with influence reaching deep into the Deccan. That scale matters, because it tells us this story is not only about kings and battles. It is about how power was organized across enormous distances, many languages, multiple religious communities, and very different local economies. The Mughal achievement was to turn conquest into governable order for long stretches of time. Their failure was that this order depended on constant balancing, military strength, elite loyalty, tax extraction, and political legitimacy all had to hold together at once. Once those balances weakened, decline accelerated. To understand the empire, we need to track three connected forces: how it was won, how it was administered, and how it was financed. Only then do its famous monuments make full sense, because those monuments were not isolated artistic miracles. They were visible signs of an imperial system fueled by land revenue, long-distance commerce, and concentrated court wealth. The empire's conventional founding date is 1526, when Babur defeated Ibrahim Lodi at the First Battle of Panipat. Babur came from Central Asian political traditions and entered North India with both ambition and external support. The Safavid and Ottoman worlds, nearby great powers of the era, formed part of the wider geopolitical environment that shaped his campaign capacity and military style. Panipat was decisive not just because one ruler defeated another, but because it shattered the existing Delhi Sultanate power structure and opened the Gangetic Plains to a new imperial project. Yet military victory alone cannot found an enduring empire. Many conquerors win battles and then disappear into rebellion, local resistance, and administrative chaos. What made Babur's success durable was that his successors inherited not only territory but an imperial claim and a strategic direction: expand, consolidate, and replace fragmented sovereignty with a centralized court authority. In this sense, Panipat was less an endpoint than an opening move. It established a dynasty, but the empire in its mature form would be built over generations, not in a single campaign season. Historians sometimes date the true imperial structure closer to Akbar's reign, and that distinction is critical. Founding and structuring are different acts. Babur created a ruling foothold. Akbar transformed that foothold into a system. Under him, governance moved toward more regularized administration, broader elite integration, and stronger mechanisms of central control. This did not mean a modern bureaucratic state in the contemporary sense, but it did mean a more predictable imperial machine. The Mughal state became better at converting local productivity into imperial revenue and better at managing diversity without relying only on raw suppression. Akbar's period demonstrates why institutional design matters more than battlefield glory in long-run imperial survival. Armies can seize capitals, but institutions decide whether tax flows continue, provincial officials obey orders, and local power holders choose cooperation over rebellion. By giving the empire a more standardized governing logic, Akbar helped create the conditions for the long 17th century phase in which the Mughal system could sustain relative internal peace, commercial growth, and a visibly wealthy court culture. One of the most striking features of Mughal rule is that it was militarily founded but not purely militarily maintained. The empire did not systematically erase the populations and cultures it governed. Instead, it often stabilized rule by incorporating diverse elites and moderating political friction through administrative accommodation. This was pragmatic statecraft. In a territory this large, coercion alone is too expensive and too brittle. You can conquer a province with force, but if local intermediaries resist tax collection, hoard grain, or sabotage communication, imperial authority decays from within. Mughal governance therefore leaned toward a calibrated blend of hierarchy and inclusion. Different social groups, regional notables, and power brokers were brought into structures that linked local influence to imperial service. This produced a form of negotiated centralization. The court remained supreme, but it depended on networks of people who had incentives to keep the system functioning. That approach helps explain both Mughal durability and its vulnerabilities. The same dependence on elite cooperation that enabled expansion could later become a weakness when loyalty fragmented or when imperial rewards no longer matched local ambitions. If we ask what really powered Mughal strength, the answer is not treasure seized in war. It was agricultural taxation. The empire's collective wealth rested on land revenue, and under Akbar especially, tax mechanisms became more systematic. Estimates suggest these taxes could take well over half of a peasant cultivator's output. That figure is enormous, and it reveals both administrative capacity and social burden. To extract at that scale without permanent breakdown, an empire needs measurement practices, accountable intermediaries, enforcement credibility, and a payment system people can actually use. The Mughals tied taxation to a regulated silver currency, which had a profound economic effect. Revenue obligations pushed peasants and artisans into larger market circuits, linking village production to wider exchange networks. This was not a gentle process, it involved pressure and inequality. But from an imperial perspective, it transformed diffuse agrarian output into monetized state income. That income funded armies, courts, architecture, and political patronage. In other words, the glitter of Mughal high culture had a fiscal foundation in the fields, in extraction routines, and in the state's ability to convert crops into coin and coin into power. The 17th century is often remembered as a period when relative peace across much of Mughal territory supported economic expansion. Relative peace does not mean absence of conflict, it means fewer disruptions severe enough to continuously fracture trade and production. Stable routes, predictable authority, and enforceable contracts create confidence, and confidence attracts commerce. During this same era, European presence in the Indian Ocean was expanding, and demand for Indian goods, both raw and finished, was rising. Mughal India sat at the intersection of agricultural depth, artisanal skill, and global market appetite. The court benefited massively from these conditions, because high-value exchange amplified taxable wealth. Yet this prosperity was uneven. Imperial abundance at the top coexisted with heavy burdens below. Still, from a macro-historical view, the combination of internal order and external demand made Mughal India one of the major economic zones of the early modern world. It also tied imperial fortunes to wider trade rhythms. As commercial patterns shifted and political stresses mounted, the same interconnected economy that had fueled growth could transmit shocks more quickly across regions and institutions. Great wealth at court did not stay hidden in ledgers. It appeared in conspicuous consumption and patronage, especially under Shah Jahan. Here we should avoid a simplistic reading that monuments are merely vanity projects. Imperial spending on architecture, painting, textiles, and literary production also functioned as political communication. It displayed control over resources, command over skilled labor, and confidence in dynastic permanence. Structures like Agra Fort, Fatehpur Sikri, the Red Fort, Humayun's Tomb, Lahore Fort, and the Shalimar Gardens were not random decorative choices, they formed an imperial landscape that encoded authority in stone, geometry, and urban planning. And then there is the Taj Mahal, often described as a jewel of Muslim art and a masterpiece of world heritage. Its fame can overshadow the system behind it, but that system is the deeper historical point. Monumental culture at this scale requires sustained fiscal capacity, stable logistics, artisanal ecosystems, and an elite willing to convert wealth into enduring symbols. Mughal art and architecture were therefore both cultural achievements and structural evidence of how effectively imperial power could marshal resources over time. No account of Mughal power is complete without Aurangzeb, during whose reign the empire reached its maximum territorial extent. Expansion to that scale can look like success in maps, but every new frontier multiplies administrative strain. More territory means longer supply lines, greater military commitments, more local intermediaries to manage, and rising costs of surveillance and enforcement. Imperial overstretch is not a metaphor, it is a material condition of governance. You can see it in delayed revenue transfers, provincial bargaining, and the need to keep rewarding elites whose loyalty is never permanent. Aurangzeb inherited a formidable system and pushed it to geographic limits, but those limits carried structural consequences. After his death, the empire struggled to maintain cohesion at the same level of command. This does not mean decline began overnight, but it does mean resilience weakened. When a state's integrative mechanisms are stretched, succession disputes, regional assertion, and fiscal leakage become harder to contain. The Mughal case illustrates a classic imperial paradox. The very success of expansion can produce the conditions that make long-term stability harder to sustain. By around 1720, shortly after Aurangzeb's death, the Mughal imperial framework had entered a diminished phase. Over subsequent decades, effective control contracted sharply, and by 1760 the empire had been reduced largely to the region around Old Delhi. This contraction tells us decline was not simply a matter of foreign attack, it was a breakdown of central authority relative to provincial power and competing forces. Once the center cannot reliably command revenue, appointments, and military response across its former domain, imperial status becomes increasingly ceremonial. Regional actors gain autonomy, and political reality diverges from imperial titles. The Mughal emperor could still represent legitimacy in symbolic terms, but symbols do not collect taxes or hold distant fortresses. That distinction between nominal sovereignty and operational sovereignty is crucial for understanding late empires. In the Mughal case, the state's earlier strengths, elite integration, monetized taxation, and broad territorial management, had depended on a constant flow of compliance and coercive credibility. When that flow fractured, contraction accelerated. The court remained historically significant, but no longer functioned as the unquestioned command center of the subcontinent. The formal end came after the Indian Rebellion of 1857, when the British Raj dissolved the Mughal Empire. This final step matters because it marks the difference between de facto decline and de jure termination. Long before 1857, Mughal authority had been politically reduced. But legal abolition by a colonial regime closed the dynastic chapter in explicit constitutional terms. The empire that had once structured vast regions through its own administrative logic was now subordinated to a new imperial order with different priorities and institutional forms. Even so, the Mughal legacy did not vanish with formal dissolution. Its administrative precedents, urban centers, cultural forms, and architectural landmarks remained embedded in South Asian historical memory and material life. The afterlife of empires is often longer than their political lifespan. What people inherit is not just territory, but institutions, aesthetic languages, legal habits, and social hierarchies shaped over centuries. In that sense, 1857 was an ending and a transfer, an end to Mughal sovereignty, and a transfer of space, population, and accumulated infrastructure into a new colonial framework that would redefine power in the region. So what is the clearest way to understand the Mughal Empire in one frame? It was a conquest state that became an administrative fiscal civilization and then fragmented under the pressure of scale, succession, and shifting power conditions. Its rulers mastered the conversion of agrarian output into monetized imperial capacity. They built systems that could integrate diversity without eliminating it, and they used wealth to project legitimacy through culture and architecture. But those same systems demanded constant political maintenance. Once elite cohesion weakened and territorial management became too costly, central power thinned rapidly. This arc makes the Mughal story deeply modern in its lessons. States endure not because they win once, but because they repeatedly solve coordination problems across economy, force, and legitimacy. When those solutions stop working, decline can be gradual in appearance but structural at the core. The Mughal world therefore offers more than dramatic monuments and famous names. It offers a case study in how empires actually function, through revenue, institutions, negotiated authority, and symbolic power, all of which must align for greatness to last. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.